Kairete friends, welcome to Classics in Color, your weekly dive into some of the strangest facts of the ancient world. I'm Mark Graves, and today I'm going to be talking about some mental illnesses that plagued the ancient world. So first off, obviously I'm not a psychologist, but I would like to talk a little bit about modern psychology just because I think it's interesting and that it really relates to what I want to talk about in this video. So Richard Dawkins first put forward this theory, sometimes called meme theory, which is that ideas and thoughts are much like DNA or computer code, and that there are these little bits of information and they tend to clump together and then to replicate, and the ones that are really good at replicating become successful and common. And then this has repercussions in the real world. So it could be anything from the latest Katy Perry song getting stuck in people's heads to witch hunts. And there are many mental illnesses that people are currently wondering if they have a connection to this meme theory as well. So, for instance, bulimia. It's fairly well known that young women in that teenage kind of area, they often have mental and psychological issues. It's a tough time, and then this can manifest itself in various ways, but that it is more likely to manifest itself in disorders like bulimia and anorexia, especially if that young girl has been exposed to, say, a celebrity coming out and telling their story of bulimia. So this isn't to say that the young woman isn't experiencing some sort of pain, but it is to say that how she expresses that pain, what her symptoms are, do seem to be influenced by the social surroundings around her. So it's sort of like a mind virus. This has also been sort of talked about as far as mass shooters go, that the percentage of the likelihood of mass shooters seems to go up after the media puts mass shooters on more. Basically, that the more this idea is in the air, that it's spread, that it's put forward by the media, the more likely mass shooters are to become mass shooters. And even for suicide, there's definitely been a link demonstrated in after, say, a famous person kills themselves or a book comes out that sort of glorifies suicide, that young people are more likely to commit suicide after these things. So it's sort of weird how mental illnesses can be transferred or augmented in that way. Now, like I said, obviously I'm not a psychologist. I just think that these connections and theories are really interesting, and I would like to compare that a little bit to what the ancient world thought about some mental illnesses, because they saw a similar pattern going on. So there were two plagues of basically suicidal youths in the ancient world that were considered a problem. But suicide wasn't always considered a problem in the ancient world. Actually, they had a very different perspective on it than we do now. So whether suicide was good or bad depended on the circumstances surrounding it and the intentions. So if you killed yourself because you were a coward, because you wanted to get out of responsibility, then bad. But if you killed yourself because you thought it fulfilled your responsibility better, then that would probably be considered a good thing. We have a story from Strabo who says that on the island of Chaos, apparently there was a famine going on, and the state actually ordered 60 people to drink hemlock, which is a poison, and kill themselves basically so that there would be more food for everyone else. So kind of a Thanos type situation. So here, not only is the state okay with suicide, but it's even ordering that it take place. We also have the Roman practice of devotio. So when a general was looking at a battle and it was going pretty close, or he thought that they were losing, he might call on a god and say, hey, I really want to win this for me and for my country. Take my life in exchange for a victory. And then he would charge into battle a bit recklessly, sort of seeking death, seeking a glorious death, and giving his life in exchange for that victory. So that also was a case where suicide was basically considered a good thing. And finally, many philosophies, especially Stoicism, looked on suicide as a way to get you out of really painful circumstances or moral dilemmas. So if you were suffering from a really terrible disease and there wasn't any hope of cure, then suicide was considered okay. Or, as often happened in the ancient world, or heck, even the modern world, a lot of times people were placed in these situations where damned if you do, damned if you don't. So suicide was considered a way to sort of reassert your control and refuse to do something immoral if you didn't have any really moral options. So Pliny says about suicide But the chief consolations for nature's imperfection in the case of man are that not even for God are all things possible, for he cannot, even if he wishes, commit suicide, the supreme boon that he has bestowed on man among all the penalties of life. So that actually sounds quite positive towards suicide. And there is a famous story of Cato, who fought in Rome for the side of the Republic against Julius Caesar. So he really wanted to preserve the Republic in Rome, but when it was clear that Caesar had won and it was over, he had a dinner party with his friends and they had a nice night talking and hanging out, and then afterwards he retired to his bedroom and slit open his own guts. You may have heard this story before, but then in the process he made some noise and everybody came running and said, "Oh gosh, Cato, what are you doing?" And he said, "I'm sorry guys, won't happen again." So they had him stitched up and put back to bed, and then as soon as everyone had gone, he pulled the stitches out himself and then pulled his guts out, at least according to the story. So this was considered extremely badass and cool by most of the Romans. So this sort of gives the idea that suicide was really positive, but on the flip side of that, we also have Martial saying, Decianus, he's addressing someone, and following the tenets of great Thracia and consummate Cato, but at the same time wishing to survive, and not rushing bare-breasted upon drawn swords, you do as I would have you do. I am not for the hero who buys fame with easy blood. I am for him who can win glory without dying. So it's not like this was a universally approved practice. There were definitely people who thought Cato was being a little melodramatic here, and thought people should tone it down. So Martial here is definitely pushing back against this idea. He's saying, Cato is being a little melodramatic, y'all should calm it down. And at the time, many schoolboys were required to memorize some of the speeches that Cato gave, especially the last one that he gave at that dinner party. So he's saying, look, I know all you boys have been raised on Cato, calm down a little bit. And also there was some stigma around committing suicide, especially depending on the circumstances. So suicide victims were often considered more likely to become ghosts, especially if they were young. Because if you were young, you hadn't lived a full life, there were things that you hadn't done yet, so you were more likely to be restless, to want something from the living or from life still, and to come back and potentially cause problems. So suicide, much more of a mixed bag in the ancient world than in the modern world. So one instance of a mind virus or some sort of mental illness plague happening in the ancient world was a basically plague of suicides that happened in Athens, according to myth. As I've said in another video, young women had a particular problem with mental illness, apparently. They were often diagnosed with what was called hysteria, which they thought was caused by the womb getting out of control. So the womb was thought to be a little animal unto itself, and it could wander around the body at will, and it could chew on you, cause physical pain, but it could also cause emotional distress. And it could manifest itself in a whole lot of different symptoms, but often girls would kill themselves. And sort of the signature way they would do this was through hanging. For some reason, that was considered a particularly feminine way to go out. Now, there's a myth that this wasn't just an isolated thing, this was a whole plague, and it's the myth of Erigone. So Erigone was just a normal peasant girl, which is unusual for a myth and kind of cool. And her father was Icarius, and apparently he was friends with Dionysus. Dionysus gave him some wine, in some stories some of the very first wine ever, and he had a big party with his bros, and they got quite drunk, as you would if you had the world's first wine and you didn't know what you were doing. And apparently they had a brawl and they killed Erigone's father, and then they were scared by this and they buried him in the woods and didn't tell anyone about it. Erigone obviously still realizes that her father's missing and she's very distressed. And then her dog, we even get the dog's name, which is really cute. Myra comes and finds her and leads her into the woods, and Myra is able to sniff out where the father is buried, Icarius. And once Erigone realizes what has happened, she's very distressed. And she's also kind of annoyed, I guess, because she realizes she can't avenge herself on these men by herself. She's just a girl. So maybe for that reason she kills herself, hoping that she'll come back as this vengeful ghost. So she does, and it's sort of a bird box scenario. So she goes and she visits the young women of Athens, and she drives them insane, and they all start hanging themselves. And obviously, the citizens of Athens are terrified at this. They're quite freaked out, and they eventually figure out Arigne's whole story and what has happened, and then they're able to either execute or exile the men who killed her father. And then they also institute this festival every year in which they honor they honor her wish literally that all the girls of Athens hang, but they find a way around it. So all the girls will come out to the woods, and they will either sit in swings and hang from trees that way, or they'll bring a doll and sort of hang that on the tree in proxy. So on the surface, this looks like a very cute, festival for little girls with dolls and swings, but it's also like very dark and disturbing. It's a bit like Ring Around the Rosie in that way, I think. Just this childness and also very much darkness intertwined. So that is an example of a mind virus or a mental illness plague taking over Athens. And then the second example of this that I want to talk about takes place in Rome, and it's for young men. So I told you the story of Cato and how he committed this badass suicide that everybody looked up to and that these young boys were studying in school. And then they grew up, and many of them wanted to commit suicide or did commit suicide. It was a bit of a death cult. I'm exaggerating a bit, but it was a problem. And many people looked on this as a problem. For example, Seneca was intellectual of the time, and he wrote many treatises sort of steering people away from this, saying, yes, you can be a stoic, you can be tough, but you don't have to kill yourself with a drop of the hat. And he sort of encouraged a new way of looking at stoicism, a bit more of a popular way. Ironically, though, Seneca did end up killing himself in his old age, although it wasn't his decision. Nero basically ordered him to, which was sort of like telling someone to resign. It's giving them a bit of dignity, but saying, yeah, you still have to go. So Seneca gets this order to kill himself, and it was considered a bit better than just executing them. It was considered more honorable. And if you're executed, then the state gets to confiscate your property, but if you kill yourself, then you get to still pass on inheritances to your family if you want. So he's like, okay, I'm a philosopher, I'm tough, I can do this. So he slits his wrists, but apparently he's very old, so his blood flow is very slow, so it's not really coming out. So then he takes some poison, and the poison doesn't work, and then he goes to the bath, because he's hoping that the hot bath will speed up his blood and it'll drain out faster. And I guess that still doesn't work, because they say that he eventually died by choking on the steam of the bath. So I'm not exactly sure how that works, but it's just sad that he had to work so hard to kill himself, basically. And like I read you above, Marshall was also someone who pushed against this idea of the noble suicide and saying, look, I know that's an easier way out sometimes, but you all should really figure out a way to live a noble life. So there was enough pushback that apparently this didn't get as out of hand as the Arigne situation, but it was still a problem. So thank you so much for checking out this video on mind viruses. This was Classics in Color with Mark Graves. I hope to see you again next week. Karate!